He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 weeks, hadn't felt the warmth of human touch in 20 years. But when Mercy Whitmore knocked on his weathered door that morning, everything Silas Ward thought he knew about loneliness was about to change forever. The sun hung high over the dusty ranch as Silas stepped onto his porch, squinting at the figure standing before him, a woman in a faded blue dress, her auburn hair catching the light, holding a small leather satchel in her weathered hands. She looked tired, determined, and completely out of place on his isolated property. "Mr. Ward?" Her voice carried a strength that surprised him. "I'm Mercy Whitmore. I heard in town you might teach someone to work a ranch." Silas felt his chest tighten. 20 years of silence had made conversations feel foreign, like speaking a language he'd almost forgotten. He studied her face, noting the lines around her green eyes that spoke of hardship, the way her chin lifted with quiet defiance despite her obvious exhaustion. "Don't take students," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "Especially not." He gestured vaguely, unsure how to finish the sentence without sounding cruel. "Especially not women." Mercy stepped closer, and Silas caught the faint scent of lavender soap mixed with trail dust. "I can work harder than most men you know. I just need someone to show me how." Something in her tone made him pause. It wasn't pleading or desperate. It was matter-of-fact, like she was stating an inevitable truth. Silas ran a hand through his graying beard, feeling the familiar weight of solitude pressing against his shoulders. "Why here?" he asked. "Why me?" Mercy's eyes swept across the ranch, taking in the well-maintained fences, the clean barn, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. "Because they say you're the best. And because—" She hesitated, her fingers tightening on her satchel. "Because I need to learn fast." The urgency in those last words sent a chill through Silas. He'd spent 2 decades avoiding complications, avoiding anything that might disturb the careful emptiness he'd built around himself. But standing there, looking at this woman who'd somehow found his hidden ranch, he felt something stirring that he'd thought was buried forever. "Can't pay much," Mercy added quickly, "but I'm willing to work for the teaching. Cooking, cleaning, whatever you need." Silas felt his resolve wavering. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about strangers and complications, and the peaceful life he'd carved from grief. But another part, a part that had been silent for so long he'd forgotten it existed, whispered that maybe 20 years of loneliness was enough. "Milking starts before dawn," he said finally, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Work doesn't end till the sun sets. It's hard, dirty, and unforgiving." A smile spread across Mercy's face, transforming her tired features into something radiant. "When do we start?" As Silas watched her clutch that leather satchel tighter, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was running from something, and he had no idea that teaching her to milk his cows would be the easy part of what was coming. The next morning, Silas woke to find Mercy already waiting by the barn, her dress replaced by men's work clothes that hung loose on her frame. She stood perfectly still in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the stars fade into gray sky, as if she'd been there for hours. "Thought you might change your mind," Silas said, carrying 2 wooden buckets toward the corral where his Jersey cows waited, their breath visible in the cool air. "I don't change my mind," Mercy replied, falling into step beside him. Her voice held the same quiet determination from the day before, but Silas noticed how her eyes kept darting toward the horizon, like she was expecting something to emerge from the morning mist. Inside the barn, Silas positioned a 3-legged stool beside Bessie, his gentlest cow. The familiar smell of hay and warm animal filled the space between them as he demonstrated the proper grip, the rhythm of pulling and releasing that would coax milk from the udder. "Firm but gentle," he explained. His hands moving with practiced ease. "Too rough and she'll kick. Too soft and nothing happens." When Mercy took the stool, her first attempts were clumsy, her city-soft hands unfamiliar with the work. But she didn't complain when Bessie shifted restlessly, didn't flinch when the cow's tail swished across her face. Instead, she watched Silas with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, like she was memorizing every movement, every word. "You learn fast," he said after she managed to produce a steady stream of milk. It was true. Most people took days to develop the rhythm, but Mercy seemed to absorb the knowledge desperately, as if her life depended on it. "Had to learn everything fast," she said, then bit her lip like she'd revealed too much. Silas felt that familiar warning bell in his chest. He'd spent 20 years avoiding other people's problems, other people's secrets. but something about the way Mercy concentrated on her work, the way she never once complained about the ache in her back or the protest from her unused muscles, made him curious despite himself. "Where you from?" he asked, settling onto a hay bale to watch her work. Mercy's hands stilled for just a moment. "East," she said finally. "Far east." It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. Silas studied her profile in the lamplight, noting how she kept her back to the barn door, how she startled slightly whenever the wind rattled the wooden walls. Running from something? The question slipped out before he could stop it. This time Mercy turned to look at him directly, her green eyes holding shadows he recognized. They were the same shadows he'd carried for 20 years, the kind that came from losing everything that mattered. "Aren't we all?" she said softly. The simple truth of it hit Silas like a physical blow. Yes, he was running too. Running from memories of his wife Sarah's laugh, from the empty space in their bed, from the life they'd planned but never got to live. He'd been running so long he'd forgotten there was any other way to exist. "The work helps," he said, surprising himself with the admission. "Keeps the mind busy." Mercy nodded, understanding passing between them without words. She returned to milking, and they worked in comfortable silence as the sun crested the hills, painting the barn walls gold. But when Silas stepped outside to pour the milk into the cooling tank, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks in the soft earth near the road. Too fresh to be from yesterday's mail delivery. Someone had been watching the ranch, and from the depth of the prints, they'd stayed for a long time. As he walked back into the barn, seeing Mercy bent over her work with such determined focus, Silas realized that whatever she was running from might have just found her. Silas didn't mention the horse tracks, but he found himself watching the horizon more carefully as he taught Mercy to mend fences that afternoon. She worked with the same desperate focus she'd shown in the barn, her soft hands already beginning to callous from the wire and tools. "Why didn't you ever remarry?" Mercy asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence they'd settled into. She was struggling with a stubborn fence post, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool autumn air. The question caught Silas off guard. He'd grown so accustomed to solitude that personal inquiries felt like intrusions into sacred space. But something about Mercy's tone wasn't prying. It was understanding, like she already knew the weight of loss. "Some wounds don't heal," he said finally, helping her steady the post. "Some people aren't meant to love twice." Mercy paused in her work, looking at him with those green eyes that seemed to see too much. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." "Is it?" Silas found himself studying her face, noting the way she unconsciously touched a thin band of pale skin on her ring finger, where a wedding band had once been. "Seems to me you might understand." She turned back to the fence with renewed vigor, but not before he caught the flicker of pain that crossed her features. Understanding something doesn't make it less sad. They worked until the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, and Silas found himself relaxing into conversation for the first time in years. Mercy had a way of asking questions that didn't feel invasive, of listening that didn't demand answers he wasn't ready to give. But as they walked back toward the house, Silas noticed Mercy's steps slowing, her eyes scanning the approaching darkness with unmistakable fear. Whatever confidence she'd shown during the day seemed to evaporate with the fading light. "You can take the spare room," he said, the offer surprising them both. "Just until you figure out your next move." Relief flooded her face so completely that Silas felt a stab of protective anger toward whatever had put such fear there. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I won't be any trouble." But trouble found them anyway. As they reached the porch, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their faces hidden in shadow, but their intent clear in the deliberate way they approached. Mercy went rigid beside him, her breathing shallow and quick. "They found me," she said, so quietly he almost missed it. Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, a fierce protectiveness that overrode his instinct to avoid conflict. Without thinking, he stepped in front of Mercy, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle he kept by the door. "Friends of yours?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from the terror radiating from the woman behind him. The riders drew closer, and in the dying light, Silas could make out hard faces and the glint of metal at their sides. Whatever Mercy was running from had teeth, and it had finally caught up to her on his land. As the lead rider called out a greeting that sounded more like a threat, Silas realized his 20 years of peaceful isolation were about to come to a violent end. "Evening," the lead rider called out, his voice carrying false friendliness that made Silas's skin crawl. The man was thick-set with cruel eyes that lingered too long on Mercy. "We're looking for a woman. Auburn hair, green eyes. Goes by Mercy." Silas felt Mercy's hand grip his arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. He could feel her trembling, but when he glanced back, her chin was raised in defiance despite the fear in her eyes. "Don't know anyone by that name," Silas said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're on private property." The man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Now that's interesting, because we tracked her horse right to your door." He gestured toward the other riders who spread out slightly, a practiced movement that spoke of violence and intimidation. "Jeremiah," Mercy spoke for the first time, stepping out from behind Silas despite his attempt to keep her protected. "I told you I was never coming back." Jeremiah's false smile vanished, replaced by something cold and possessive. "You don't get to decide that, wife. You took something that belongs to me." The word wife hit Silas like a physical blow, but not for the reasons he'd expected. It wasn't jealousy that flooded through him, but rage at the way Jeremiah said it, like Mercy was property to be reclaimed, rather than a person who'd made a choice. "I took nothing that wasn't already mine," Mercy said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "The money was my father's, left to me. You had no right to it." "Your father's dead," Jeremiah spat. "What was his became mine when you married me, just like you did." His hand moved to rest on the gun at his hip, a casual threat that made Silas's blood run cold. But it was the next words that changed everything. "And just like our son does," Mercy gasped, the sound torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "Thomas is safe where you'll never find him." Silas felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Mercy wasn't just running from an abusive husband, she was protecting a child. The desperate way she'd learned every task, the constant vigilance, the fear that never left her eyes, it all made terrible sense now. "See, that's where you're wrong," Jeremiah said, his smile returning like a predator scenting blood. "Boys belong with their fathers, and wives belong with their husbands. We're going home, Mercy, all of us." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Silas could feel the weight of the rifle in his hands, could calculate the odds of taking down 3 armed men before they could hurt Mercy. But 20 years of avoiding violence warred with something newer, fiercer, a protectiveness he'd thought died with his wife. "She's not going anywhere," Silas heard himself say, the words cutting through the tension like a blade. "Not with you." Jeremiah's eyes shifted to him, assessment and dismissal warring in his gaze. "Old man, this doesn't concern you. Walk away." But Silas had spent 20 years walking away from life, from connection, from anything that mattered. He looked at Mercy, saw the hope and terror battling in her face, and made a choice that would change everything. "I'm not walking anywhere," he said, raising the rifle. "But you are. Off my land. Now." The silence that followed was pregnant with violence, and Silas knew that whatever happened next would determine whether Mercy's desperate flight for freedom would end in tragedy or triumph. Jeremiah's hand twitched toward his gun, but something in Silas's steady gaze made him hesitate. 20 years of isolation had taught Silas patience, and 20 years of loss had taught him that some things were worth dying for. "You're making a mistake, old man," Jeremiah said, his voice losing its false friendliness. "That woman is mine by law, and the boy." "The boy is safe," Mercy interrupted, her voice stronger now with Silas standing beside her. "And he'll stay safe. I left him with people who actually care about him, not men who see children as property to be owned." Silas felt a surge of admiration for her courage, even as he calculated distances and angles. The 2 other riders had positioned themselves to flank the porch, but they seemed content to let Jeremiah do the talking for now. "You can't hide forever, Mercy," Jeremiah said, his mask slipping further to reveal the cruel man beneath. "I've got resources. Connections. Every town between here and the territories knows to watch for you." "Then it's a good thing she's not hiding," Silas said quietly. "She's learning, working, building something new." The simple statement seemed to catch Jeremiah off guard. His eyes darted between Silas and Mercy, trying to read the dynamic between them. "What's she to you? You barely know her." It was a fair question, one Silas couldn't fully answer himself. 3 days ago, he'd been content in his solitude, wrapped in grief like a familiar coat. But watching Mercy struggle to master new skills while fighting her own demons had awakened something in him he'd thought was dead. She's under my protection, Silas said simply. That's all you need to know. Jeremiah's face darkened with frustrated rage. Protection? From a broken-down rancher who talks to his cows more than people? He gestured dismissively. I could burn this place to the ground and no one would care. But it was Mercy who responded, stepping forward with fire in her green eyes. You're wrong about him, and you're wrong about me. I'm not the scared girl who married you. I'm not the woman who let you control every breath I took. I learned to shoot, Jeremiah. I learned to fight. And I learned that I'd rather die free than live as your property. The conviction in her voice sent chills down Silas's spine. This wasn't the desperate woman who'd knocked on his door begging for help. This was someone who'd found her strength in the darkest places and forged it into something unbreakable. Jeremiah's composure cracked completely. You think this old fool can protect you? You think hiding out here changes anything? He raised his voice, the sound echoing across the valley. I'll be back, Mercy, with more men, with papers from the territorial judge. And when I come back, your protector here might just have an accident. The threat hung in the air like poison, but as the three riders wheeled their horses around and disappeared into the gathering darkness, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. He felt alive. The silence after the riders disappeared felt heavier than the confrontation itself. Mercy stood frozen on the porch, her hands shaking as the adrenaline slowly drained from her system. Silas lowered his rifle but kept it close, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. They'll be back, Mercy said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeremiah never makes empty threats, and now he knows you'll stand against him. Silas nodded, understanding the weight of what he'd just committed to. 20 years of careful isolation, destroyed in a matter of minutes by a woman with green eyes and more courage than sense. But as he looked at her standing there, defiant despite her fear, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Tell me about your son, he said gently, leading her inside the small farmhouse. The interior was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade pieces that spoke of long, solitary evenings spent working with his hands. Mercy sank into a chair by the cold fireplace, exhaustion replacing adrenaline. Thomas is 6. He has my eyes but his father's stubborn streak. A small smile touched her lips. I left him with my sister in Kansas City. She runs a boarding house, has enough people around that one more child won't be noticed. And the money Jeremiah mentioned? My father left me a substantial inheritance when he died last year. Jeremiah saw it as his right, but the will was specific. It was mine alone. Her hands clenched in her lap. He used Thomas to control me, threatened to hurt him if I didn't sign everything over. So I took what I could carry and ran. Silas understood desperation, the way it could drive someone to make impossible choices. He'd made his own desperate choice 20 years ago, choosing isolation over the risk of loving and losing again. Why learn ranching? He asked. Why not just keep running? Mercy looked around the modest room, taking in the simple furniture, the sense of permanence and peace that Silas had built for himself. Because I'm tired of running. Because Thomas deserves a real home, not a life spent looking over our shoulders. I thought if I could learn to work the land, maybe buy a small place somewhere remote, we could disappear completely. The logic was sound, but Silas could see the flaw in her plan. Jeremiah found you here. He'll find you anywhere. Then what do you suggest? The question came out sharper than she'd intended, born from fear and frustration. That I go back to him? Let him raise my son to be like him? No. The firmness in Silas's voice surprised them both. I suggest we make sure he can't find you again. Mercy stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. Silas moved to the window, checking the darkness outside one more time before turning back to her. I've been alone for 20 years, Mercy. I thought that was what I wanted, what I deserved. But these past few days, watching you fight for something better, watching you refuse to give up. He paused, struggling with words that felt foreign after so long. Maybe some wounds can heal if you let them. Silas, Mercy began, but he held up a hand. Jeremiah was right about one thing. I am a broken-down rancher who talks to his cows more than people. But I know this land, know the territories better than any city man ever could. And I know that sometimes the best place to hide is right where you are, if you're strong enough to make a stand. The promise in his words was clear, and Mercy felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine hope. But as she looked into Silas's weathered face, she saw something else that made her breath catch. She saw a man who was ready to love again, even if it meant risking everything he'd built from the ashes of his grief. 3 weeks passed without sign of Jeremiah, but Silas knew better than to trust the quiet. He'd spent those weeks teaching Mercy everything he could about the ranch, about the land, about surviving in places where the law was more suggestion than reality. She absorbed every lesson with the same desperate focus she'd shown that first morning in the barn. But it was the moments between the lessons that changed everything. The way she hummed while cooking breakfast, filling his empty house with music he'd forgotten he missed. The way she laughed when one of his more stubborn cows refused to cooperate, a sound that made his chest ache with something that wasn't grief. The way she touched his hand when passing him tools, small gestures that reminded him what human warmth felt like. "You've changed," Mercy said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. "When I first arrived, you looked like a man who'd forgotten how to live." Silas considered this, watching the last light fade from the sky. Maybe I had. Maybe it took someone else fighting for their life to remind me mine was worth living. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither quite dared to name. But when Mercy's hand found his in the gathering darkness, Silas felt 20 years of ice around his heart begin to crack. The moment shattered with the thunder of approaching horses. But this time it wasn't 3 riders emerging from the tree line. It was nearly a dozen, including a man in a marshal's badge riding beside Jeremiah. "Mercy Whitmore," the marshal called out, his voice carrying legal authority. "I have a warrant for your arrest. Theft, abandonment of marriage, kidnapping of a minor child." Silas felt Mercy's hand tighten on his, felt her stiffen with familiar fear. But when she stood, it wasn't with the terror of a cornered animal. It was with the dignity of a woman who'd found her strength. "Marshal," she said clearly, "I have documents proving my father's inheritance was legally mine. I have witnesses to my husband's threats against my child, and I have the right to protect my son from a man who sees violence as his birthright." "Pretty words," Jeremiah snarled, dismounting with obvious satisfaction. "But you're still coming with us." That's when Silas stood, and in his hand was a folded paper that made Jeremiah's face go white. "Funny thing about territorial law," Silas said conversationally. "A woman can't be compelled to return to a marriage that's been legally dissolved." The marshal frowned, taking the document. "This is a divorce decree, filed in Denver 3 weeks ago," Silas confirmed, "along with evidence of domestic violence and threats against a minor child. Amazing how fast justice moves when you know the right territorial judge." Jeremiah's carefully constructed authority crumbled as the marshal read the papers. But it was Mercy's next words that delivered the final blow. "Thomas is already legally in my sister's custody. Your claim on him died with our marriage. Jeremiah, you have no power here anymore." As the riders disappeared into the night, defeated and empty-handed, Silas turned to find Mercy looking at him with wonder and something deeper. "How?" she whispered. "A man with 20 years of solitude learns to write very persuasive letters," he said softly. "And sometimes love makes us braver than we thought possible." When she kissed him under the star-filled sky, Silas finally understood that some wounds don't heal alone. Sometimes they heal in the warmth of another person's hope, in the courage it takes to fight for a future worth having. 6 months later, when Thomas arrived to find his mother glowing with happiness and a man who taught him to milk cows with patient hands, Mercy knew she'd found more than sanctuary on Silas Ward's ranch. She'd found home. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.